So now I'd like to introduce Ambassador Kim Suk, who will moderate this session. Ambassador Kim Suk is the former ambassador of Republic of Korea to the UN and now serves as the executive director of the Ban Ki-moon Foundation for a Better Future. Ambassador Kim Suk served with more than 35 years of experience in foreign service and intelligence, with key postings in Washington, D.C., New York, New Delhi, San Francisco, Toronto, and within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Korea. He is well regarded for his expertise in Korea-US relations, inter-Korea relations, and the North Korean nuclear issue. Ambassador Kim most recently served as the Parliament representative of Parliament Mission of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations from July 2011 to September 2013, as President of the Security Council for month of February in 2013. Ambassador Kim led the Council and handled the Council's action regarding North Korea's ballistic missile launch and third nuclear test. Ambassador Kim was first Deputy Director for the National Intelligence Service from 2009, where he worked extensively on national security, including intelligence, preemption of security threats, and regional security issues. Ambassador Kim has also served as Special Representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs at MOFAT in Seoul, and led the ROK delegation in the six-party talks on the North Korean nuclear issue in 2008. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Kim Suk. Thank you. Please give him a big round of applause.
Well, thank you very much for a kind, rather lengthy introduction. I have to say that we're running 15 minutes late from the start. Even though this is not my fault, I have to apologize according to Korean courtesy. And welcome to our session, and thank you very much for waiting for this session, for special session for 70th anniversary of Korea-US alliance. Let me go briefly over what we're going to discuss this session. The ROK-US alliance has been an indispensable pillar of peace and security and stability in Northeast Asia for 70 years now. It has played an essential role in bolstering regional security and promoting economic growth and advancing the values like democracy and liberalism, democratic values. This session is, I think, quite timely, as North Korea, as you know, attempted and failed the launch of its military reconnaissance satellite into orbit yesterday morning. And well, as we all remember, President Yoon paid the state visit to the United States in April and had a very successful summit meeting in recent years with President Joe Biden, producing two historically important, I would stress, historically important document like joint communique and the Washington Declaration. As the alliance celebrates its 70th anniversary, this session will first, I think, reflect on past achievement, and then identify current challenges and probably some pitfalls, and chart a path forward in a world that is rapidly changing. But I would say the primary focus of our session would be stressed on the future side, to explore ways to advance the ROK-US alliance to a global, comprehensive strategic partnership. When I was in New York as ambassador to UN, the like-minded group, including US, Britain, France, some other countries, gathered and shared our opinion under the name of the horizon screening. So we need to think that way, thinking way forward on our 70 years of alliance. Now, let me introduce our esteemed speakers. First, in the center, we have our keynote speaker, Ambassador Philip Goldberg, the ambassador of the US to the ROK. His diplomatic career spans over 4 decades now, and he's one of very few seasoned and experienced career diplomat in the US Foreign Service to hold the highest rank of career ambassador. We are very honored to have such able and experienced ambassador like Ambassador Goldberg. He will deliver the keynote speech, and he will also be joining for the panel discussion to be followed. To my left, we have Mr. Patrick Cronin, the Asia Pacific Security Chair of the Hudson Institute. Next, we have Mr. Lee Soo-hoon, an Associate Research Fellow from the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. And besides Ambassador Goldberg, Ms. Alison Hooker, the Senior Vice President of American Global Strategies. And lastly, we have Mr. Kim Hyun-uk, a professor from the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Yes, thank you for participating in this valuable session. And without further ado, I would like to invite, maybe over there, yes. That would be much nicer because you have a backdrop of 2 great flags behind you. Yes, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kim. It wouldn't be a keynote address if I didn't stand up, if I just kept sitting there. So it's great to be here today with you on this beautiful island of Jeju to discuss the enduring depth and breadth of the U.S.-Korea alliance. I'm joined on stage, obviously, by some very sharp minds who are ready to discuss our 2 countries' Indo-Pacific strategies, our presence here on the Korean Peninsula, and our great relations with the ROK. I know we'll cover that topic more during the discussion and Q&A, but what I want to focus on this afternoon is the remarkable expansion of our alliance from one that was primarily security-focused into a comprehensive global strategic alliance, as Ambassador Kim mentioned, spanning the arenas of not only security, but also the economy, democracy, and other fields. In just 70 years, we've done all of that. And I had the pleasure last month of participating in the state visit hosted by President Biden in honor of President Yoon. Our 2 leaders announced a new forum to discuss the full range of our combined defense capabilities, signed 23 MOUs in the high-tech and clean energy sectors, and agreed for NASA to team up with Korean experts to increase our joint space exploration. Their meetings left me reflecting on the past, present, and future of our alliance, and the peace and prosperity it brought first to Korea and now globally. I want to touch briefly on the past, which was the genesis of our security relationship. As I mentioned, 2023 marks the 70th anniversary of our historic alliance, which is historic not only because of its endurance over 7 decades, but historic in its reach. While its mission is still centered in the Korean Peninsula to defend the Korean people, Korea has become a net security provider, both regionally and globally. We're natural partners because our alliance is based on shared values. We share a vision for a world governed by democratic norms, human rights, and the rule of law. We're agile and adapting to changing landscapes, expanding our alliance to incorporate every aspect of global security, sustainable development, technological advancement, and economic stability. And it's important to remember why that has happened. It's happened because of that 70-year presence, our alliance together, in providing the security umbrella that has allowed Korea to progress to where it is today as a technological, scientific superpower and as a country that is now expanding in the world through its cultural and other entrances to international attention. And it's a remarkable achievement, and it's now playing a greater role on the world scene. And the United States is committed to using our alliance and our great partnership to help advance that. So our joint commitment to these core values forms the basis of our bilateral policy and strategy. For this reason, President Biden put it well when he said that the alliance was formed in war and has flourished in peace. It's this foundation, the foundation of an alliance forged in blood and strengthened by time and experience, that inspires me and my Korean counterparts as we pivot to face the challenges of the present and the future. Together, the United States and Korea have molded a present where we are partners for good, where we combine our strengths to create innovative solutions and secure our mutual prosperity. We see this today, particularly with our partnership in the economic sphere. In May, our two presidents reaffirmed the centrality of the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement to each of our economies. Thanks to this agreement, our trade relationship has grown to over $227 billion worth of products and services each year. That's a 17% increase from last year alone, and 65% greater than when the agreement went into effect. And it's clear we share a love for road trips and good barbecue, but these figures are very important because they show that the two-way trade and investment is benefiting both countries. Hyundai and Kia vehicles, including a growing line of popular electric vehicles, topped Korea's exports to the United States in 2022. For the United States, Korea represents our largest overseas market for U.S. beef, with over $2.7 billion in U.S. beef exports to Korea last year, a whopping 343% increase over the past 10 years. Our partnership ensures peace in the region in cooperation with like-minded partners and the international community as we work together to deter any potential aggression from DPRK forces, particularly the threat or use of weapons of mass destruction. Yesterday's test launch, as Ambassador Kim mentioned, is another reminder of the centrality and the importance of our alliance and our defense commitments. Visits by the Nimitz and Reagan carrier strike groups and deployment of strategic bombers earlier this year are just a couple of examples of our commitment to extended deterrence. The Washington Declaration, signed by our leaders in April, confirms our country's efforts to protect peace and ensure security in the Korean Peninsula. Our ironclad alliance consistently delivers on positive results for both of our nations and for our allies across the globe. So, what does the future hold? This year marks the 70th anniversary of our alliance, and we've transformed that what was once that partnership for the security on the peninsula into the expanded comprehensive alliance. When President Biden took office, Korean companies, since he took office, Korean companies have invested more than $100 billion in the United States, driving innovation and creating new jobs for Korean and American workers. It's important also to keep in mind that we're counting on Korean companies to help us meet our green economy goals, to help us reduce carbon emissions through the creation of these factories and fabs in the United States, which will help us innovate and continue to expand our technological base and help us secure supply chains. As we prosper, we'll also consider and confront the destabilizing actions of reckless states like North Korea. We still believe that diplomacy is the only viable way to achieve a safe and stable Korean peninsula free of nuclear weapons. And both President Biden and Yoon called on the DPRK to immediately return to negotiations as part of the Washington Declaration. Outside of the region, our governments are forces for good, from addressing the climate crisis to strengthening global health, to standing up against assaults on freedom, as we're doing in Ukraine. All of these are signs of what's happening now and into the future. We rely on our steadfast cooperation to tackle these challenges together. Presidents Biden and Yoon recognize, for example, on the climate front, that we're at a crossroads where we need to make the right decisions to ensure the safety of future generations. And for this reason, our two countries are committed to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions and growing our renewable and nuclear energy sectors. The U.S. is making historic investments in clean energy and climate action. Our clean energy transition, as I mentioned, depends on ROK companies that produce critical components like EV batteries and solar panels. We're also working to reduce gas emissions on a global scale through our Green Shipping Challenge. Our international development agencies, for their part, are sharing their expertise to help developing countries respond to the climate crisis. Our countries recognize the importance of maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific that's connected, prosperous, secure, and resilient. Our respective Indo-Pacific strategies are the roadmaps that will guide us in securing this vision for a bright future. Underpinning all of these efforts, we have the support of something that our two countries have a lot of: friendship and people-to-people relationships. That's why, as you saw during the state visit, our countries are deepening the ties between our two peoples through educational cooperation, particularly in the areas of STEM. Last month in Washington, our presidents announced a $60 million investment in a new jointly funded educational exchange initiative that will support 2,023 Koreans and 2,023 Americans, symbolic of the year 2023 and the 70th anniversary of our alliance, going in each direction. These young people are our investment in the future of the alliance and will lead the way in helping us in the next 70 years. And so we're here, leaps and bounds from the past, with our steps firmly rooted in building a mutually prosperous future for our two countries. A future that I'm confident we'll achieve because we're working towards it together as equal partners. And that means a lot to us. Each person here reinforces our ironclad alliance through continuing its legacy of mutual respect, our continued collaboration on policies and practices such as championing democracy and human rights, our partnerships in the fields of science and technology to better the lives of others, and a host of other initiatives in which many of you here exercise key roles. As President Biden said to President Yoon last month, ours is a future filled with unimaginable opportunity and endless possibility. Nothing is beyond our ability to reach what our nations and people can do when united. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Ambassador Goldberg, for your overarching description of our alliance. Among your description, I note that we are natural alliance based on shared value. Natural alliance has been rarely heard, and this is a good expression. And you also said that our partnership is our ironclad alliance to deter any possible aggression from North Korea, and we have to tackle the reckless nation like North Korea. Yours was very inspiring and reassuring. Thank you very much again. Now, next, let's turn to our four speakers, and each panelists will have 10 minutes for their presentation. And after 4 presentations, time permitted, we shall have some kind of cross discussion among the panelists. And still, we have time, then I will open the floor. I very much doubt so. But so now, shall we begin with Patrick?
Ambassador Kim-Suk, thank you so much, and what a great pleasure to hear from Ambassador Goldberg an important statement about the great state of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. On this occasion, I'd like to start by saying a few words about the history, because out of horrible things, out of war, sometimes very good things happen. And here at a peace forum in Jeju, I think it's important to remember that beauty can grow out of horrible things. And we see the horror in Ukraine these days, and we're hoping that beautiful things will be emerging in the future there in Europe. When I think about what grew out of the crucible of World War II and what grew out of the Korean War, I can't help but think personally about 2 of my uncles who went to war. One was on the landing force at Okinawa at the close of World War II, the Pacific War, and the other parachuted behind lines against the North Koreans in 1950. And during that 5-year period, the world for the United States was transformed as we stepped up to try to build a United Nations and then tried to work with former vanquished enemies like Japan and Germany to build literally a post-war system of institutions that have brought prosperity and security for so many in the intervening years. The fact that horrible things led to the alliance that has endured for these past 70 years is particularly significant because it has brought peace and kept the peace on the peninsula despite the many attempts, including in the 1960s and 70s in particular, under Kim Il-sung, to seize military advantage once again. Deterrence has been maintained. It brought economic prosperity, and that's largely due to the Korean people. But education was key to that, and as somebody who has one hat at Carnegie Mellon University, deeply impressed with the Korean education system that has made Korea that technological leading country that is contributing answers to whether it's clean energy and dealing with climate change or dealing with advanced semiconductor chips that are driving the future economy, but also future security. And the democratic system that flourished eventually in Korea is indeed an example, and one that shouldn't be kept to the peninsula alone, but it's one that is an example to Americans on how we can rekindle our own belief in the democratic governance system. It's very important to have that kind of liberty and freedom and prosperity and security, and the alliance has helped bring all 3 of those things together. But now this linchpin alliance, it's time for it to merge outside of the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, and I think that's what the 2 leaders did. And it was breathtaking to be on the lawn, not in the good seats, Ambassador, but on the lawn with good people, though, Scott Snyder and Ambassador Tom Hubbard, and so many Koreans and Americans on the lawn to see the 2 presidents in late April. True enthusiasm, excitement on a beautiful day in the spring, and the optimism that President Yoon brings and that President Biden brought to this alliance is really carrying this relationship to deal with these big issues. Yes, we still first have to deal with North Korea. It doesn't go away. It's building up its nuclear weapons. And we need to not just have the extended deterrence succeed, as it is going to succeed through this new mechanism that will have to be built and strengthened day by the 2 sides, working together to fill in the gaps. But we also need to try diplomacy. And the administration in South Korea have tried. North Korea has rebuffed. But we must keep trying. We must keep trying. But we cannot just simply wait for North Korea to come to the bargaining table. We're going to build that deterrence, and meanwhile, let's start doing good more widely. And so what President Yoon has done to reach out to Japan and to Prime Minister Kishida has taken a lot of courage. There are a lot of downsides. There's deep, terrible, horrible history. It should never be forgotten. But going forward, these countries, Japan, South Korea, and the United States, share so much more about creating and revising the rules of the road for the future, whether it's war and peace or whether it's technology, economic policy. And that's what this new global strategic, comprehensive strategic alliance can do. It can build on that kind of minilateralism of trilateral relations with Japan, Korea, and the US to work on contributing, for instance, to the second pillar of AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US defense partnership. And there's going to be a chance in the coming years, I'm sure of this, for South Korea technology to be part of the projects that grow out of that second pillar. Similarly, without necessarily being a member of the Quad, South Korea is already working in parallel on Quad issues like the Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative in the Indo-Pacific, a shared interest. And I could go on with the G7 in the framework for economic coercion, or NATO in looking, as they will at Vilnius, and I was just in Vilnius, they're looking at protecting critical infrastructure and cybersecurity, as well as maritime domain awareness. All of those issues are things that Korea needs to be contributing to, providing those global public goods. Why? Because we need Korea. We need Korea to be part of the solution to the poly-crises, as they put it at the opening session here at the Jeju Forum today, that we're dealing with. So I would just argue that while we do have a lot of challenges, including working out the power sharing over extended deterrence, while we work out the details of what we mean by de-risking the high technology question with China, while we work out the rules for future trade, for exports, for how we stop and deal with economic coercion, and things like implementation of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has finally reached its first sort of harvest of agreement on supply chain security. All of these are exciting opportunities to be involved in, and I'm just confident, as the ambassador has said, that Korea and the United States working together will be making even more tremendous progress toward providing the security, freedom, and prosperity that we've seen in the last 7 decades, even more in the coming 7 decades. So thank you very much, Ambassador Kim-Suk.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for your optimistic view, and I agree with you on several points that you have described as a basis of your optimism. And I think one of the optimistic outcome out of the April summit meeting between two presidents was to make Korea and Japan closer. And I heard that in the near future, President Biden will host a trilateral summit meeting in Washington. That is another reassuring sign. And I thank you about your sharing optimism with us. Next, Dr. Lee Soo-hoon, you have 10 minutes as well.
Hi, can we pull up the slide, please? Yes, thank you. So, thank you, Chair, for your kind introduction. And also, I've prepared a presentation for our panel. And we're going to talk about the summit, joint statement, and also the Washington Declaration. So, this presentation sums up those two. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of the takeaways from the both documents. Before going into the summit, I'm going to walk you briefly through the Alliance 70 years, because we've had the 70 years of the Alliance. I felt it's worthwhile to really talk about what we've gone through. So we started with the patron-client relationship back in 1953 when we had the Mutual Defense Treaty. And because we fought together in the war, we call it a below the alliance. After the collapse of the Soviet Union that year from 1990 to early 2000, that was the unipolar moment, often quoted by the Charles Krauthammer. And back then, for that 1990s, of course, ROK had economic success and also the democratization. So we call it the transitional alliance. After 9/11, the alliance's role and responsibility went far beyond the scope of the military, including economic, political, and also the environmental sectors. And also in terms of geography, of course, it went over the peninsula. It covers regional and global order as well. And 2012, as Ambassador also already mentioned, we had the free trade agreement in 2012. The ROK-US trade, ROK-US investment tripled and quadrupled within that decade in between 2012 and 2021. And of course, in 2017-18, it was called, often criticized as a transactional alliance by the Trump administration with the motto of the America First strategy. And after the recent securitization of economy, we've had the partnership in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as well as cooperating in the semiconductor supply chain as well. That was the economic alliance from 1990s to early 2020s. And here we come as the Global Comprehensive Strategic Alliance. This is the recap of the recent joint statement between the two leaders. And if you look at this statement, it's divided into three parts. First, global, where they talk about from Ukraine to climate change, especially in this global sector area of chapter of the joint statement. They talk about DPRK. What it means is that DPRK is no more a bilateral issue. It's more of the global issue now to be handled. And in the regional scope, we talked about IPAF and APEC, how the alliance can work with these framework. And of course, recently, the ROK-US-Japan trilateral security cooperation. And on a bilateral level, we talked about cybersecurity and space cooperation. That actually sums up the Global Comprehensive Strategic Alliance that our leaders talked over in late April. And Washington, sorry, that was the declaration. So Washington Declaration. So this was the very first document that exclusively covers the extended deterrence by the United States on Korea. So this document is reaffirming the extended deterrence in strongest words possible. And of course, our president stated the full confidence in U.S. extended deterrence commitment. And of course, the essence of this declaration was the NCG, Nuclear Consultative Group. So in this forum, both leaders talked about discussing nuclear and strategic planning in the contingencies. And when they meet the contingency, they will have the joint execution and planning on ROK conventional and plus the U.S. nuclear operations. And one of the pillar for this declaration is providing the strategic asset, such as nuclear ballistic missile submarine. So SSBN one day in the future, we're expecting in June, so to be visiting the Korean Peninsula. So this is the arrangement that U.S. and ROK leaders never talked about before, but they actually put these into the writing and documents. So I think this is a very symbolic for the both leaders and for the two militaries as well. And the significance of the document is, of course, first, U.S. Hopes to increase its credibility for extended deterrence. There is a capability and credibility of the U.S. extended deterrence, but by having the Washington Declaration, of course, they increased the credibility of the extended deterrence. So now, domestic audiences are asking, what is the difference between NCG and MPG? NCG is still in the process of developing. I'm sure they will come up with something decent this year. But NCG, in terms of the commitment is more of the bilateral form, whereas the MPG nuclear planning group between NATO and USA is multilateral. So in terms of simply speaking, the efficiency of those two, I think the NCG would be much efficient in terms of the two countries coming to a certain agreement. And so over Washington, this sort of the dilemma had been there and still there in international politics. But recently, Commander Paul LaCamera stated that's no more question. U.S. has a certain commitment and the responsibility for the extended deterrence here. And second significance of the document is that it contains the detail of the extended deterrence. It talked about nuclear weapons included in the deterrence. That was the first time they talked about it. And third, they also talked and also stated that DPRK, the dialogue with the DPRK, a diplomatic approach is still important. So those three are takeaways from the Washington consensus. And what lies ahead? I divided into peninsula, regional, and global aspect. In terms of peninsula, institutionalization of extended deterrence mechanism is important at this point. And also, the close cooperation among the RK military, US Indo-PACOM, and US TRACOM will be important in terms of sharing information. On the regional aspect, of course, trilateral security cooperation will be important. In that regard, the providing synergy between EDSCG in Korea and EDD will be important. On a global level, of course, value-based alliance, that's the alliance called right now. Democracy, freedom, these two nations' alliance will be the leader in the region and the world that will lead the rules-based order. And ways forward, I'm repeating the strengthening this extended deterrence here and also enhancing trilateral security cooperation. Of course, I think the trilateral security cooperation can be the key for the denuclearization of North Korea. We've had multilateral talks, six-party talks, bilateral between US, DPRK, and now I think that there's a chance for trilateral to solve the problem. Last but not least, President Biden in the NSC NPR, they explained the end of the post-Cold War era, which means there's a decisive decade that we are facing. I think the RK-US will have a time to discover and set the global agenda, which will be the key for the next decade. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lee, for your detailed explanation on the current development in terms of security. Before going further to Allison, let me make a quick question for an answer of 1 minute. You mentioned here about NCG, Nuclear Consultative Group, and there are a small group of people in Korea as well who sees this as a negative result, and some people in its extremity say that Korea gave up nuclear sovereignty in exchange for an NCG. What would you respond in 1 minute?
All right. Okay. So, yeah, I also believe that I also heard that kind of notion in the public and professional area here, but one of the things is that if Korea were to become nuclear, there are many obstacles in front of it, such as we'll have to go against the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and also that will affect the series of the have the certain dominant effect in the East Asian countries where everybody else will probably try to go nuclear, but at this time, I think the NCG, what we are trying to do is have the professionals on one level and have the deputy, I think the ministers on the another level. It's going to be somewhere between MPG, a nuclear planning group, which between the US and NATO, and the EDSCG, what we have between the United States and Korea. So I think I don't want this to be politicized. But at the same time, I know there is a concern about the nuclear sovereignty. But we'll have to do the cost and benefit analysis to do so. So that's my quick response.
Well, thank you very much. And sorry for the distraction. And now the floor is yours, Alison.
Now I'm on. Thanks. Thank you, Ambassador. And it's a real honor to be on this panel today and to speak about the 70th anniversary of the alliance between the United States and the ROK. It's a special year, and I appreciate all of the comments that my colleagues have made so far, and I'll try not to be redundant, but I think I can say, and I think we've all said, that the alliance is very strong. You know, we used to say it's the strongest it's ever been. During my time in government, we always wanted to be able to say it's the strongest it's ever been, and I really think we can say that now. But even still, there's areas to expand upon. There are ways that we can deepen and further not only our friendship between the United States and South Korea, but also the alliance itself. And as we've talked about so far today, the President Biden and President Yoon had their very successful state visit a few weeks ago. And a number of outcomes, I think, really did, as we've discussed, furthered the alliance, expanded the alliance, and set a course for the future. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, were three areas that we do have a very good course set for moving the alliance forward. Number one is you can't talk about the alliance without talking about North Korea, as we have. But even on that front, there has been an expansion and a deepening of our cooperation, as Dr. Lee just explained, particularly on the extended deterrence front. But for as long as North Korea remains hostile towards South Korea and towards the United States and towards our other partners and allies and like-mindeds around the world, we're going to have to collaborate. We're going to have to cooperate on that issue. I won't go through all the details that we've discussed so far, but in addition to extended deterrence, there's been an expansion of our work on exercises. Another area that really deserves attention and was paid attention in the summit and is in the future of our cooperation is sanctions implementation. And I feel appropriate sitting next to Ambassador Goldberg, who used to work on our sanctions on North Korea. He could talk much more detail about this than I, but it's important that we continue to implement sanctions to put pressure on North Korea. And it's important that not just the United States and South Korea does this, but that we engage our like-minded partners, our allies around the world, to continue to do that. And just because we don't have consensus at the UN Security Council doesn't mean we can't continue to implement existing sanctions and to encourage our partners and allies around the world to do that. That's an area of alliance cooperation that will continue and should continue and expand into the future. As was mentioned, the expanded trilateral cooperation, security cooperation with Japan, is a huge step forward. And I really commend President Yoon for the bold and courageous steps that he took to restore the relationship. I do hope to see that continue, and I believe it will. And that's part of our alliance effort as well. And as we talked about just a moment ago, there really should be openness to dialogue and diplomacy with North Korea, but I would say that the focus of that really needs to remain that all nuclear programs and missile programs, that the ultimate goal is to eliminate these, that complete denuclearization of North Korea must remain the goal of that engagement. So that's the first area that our alliance cooperation will continue into the future, and indeed it is expanding. The second thing I'd say is global comprehensive strategic alliance is meant by just the definition of those words to extend beyond the Korean Peninsula, to extend beyond the North Korea challenge. And we are taking great steps to do that, thanks to the Biden-Yoon summit and to the work of on both sides to advance that. A couple of administrations ago, we used the term new frontiers of the alliance. And, Ambassador Lippert, who was here at the time, really deserves the credit for coining that phrase. And I should, he owes me a drink because I continue to talk about it. But I raise it because it was the first time that I had really heard our administration and South Korea think beyond the peninsula and to put language to it. And at that time, those new frontiers, entailed cybersecurity, global health, and climate change. Well, today, as you know, we've gone even further beyond those frontiers, and we're beginning to work together on the emerging technologies, such as AI, semiconductors, EV batteries, quantum technology, biotechnology, biomanufacturing, and autonomous robots, things that are far beyond my expertise. But our two countries have a great record of innovation, and we should be working together to make advancements in these fields, and we are. And I believe this is the future of the alliance as well. This was all captured, some of this work was captured in the state visit documents that Dr. Lee walked through. But the work that we do on this will make great strides in making a positive impact on the global supply chain, making it more resilient, and on our economic security and prosperity, both for the United States, South Korea, and our like-minded partners and our allies around the world. Particularly because there is, a great power competition going on, and much of the focus of that is on the tech dominance and the future of the technology field. I think it only makes sense for us to work together to ensure that both of our countries are strong on this front. And in the third category of things that we are advancing our alliance and is the future of the alliance is, as we've talked about today, and I would just touch on briefly, we should be working to meet the global challenges. President Yoon's concept of Korea as a global pivotal state has been talked about here at the forum as well. I don't think we've mentioned it so far in our discussions yet, but this bold vision actually, I think, advances our ability to work globally together around the world. And what I mean by that is, in previous administrations, of course, you had Korea looking to the world, looking for its place in the world through policies like globalization and Global Korea. Korea's been on a trajectory of taking its place on the global stage and having the kind of impact that it can. And Global Pivotal Korea can advance Korea even further. It is advancing Korea even further into the next phase of increasing its global influence. And I think this will only benefit the U.S.-ROC alliance, actually. It expands the borders in which we can work together, as I've already mentioned on the tech front, but also to meet the challenges that we find ourselves in, the global challenges, the hotspots around the world. As I said, this will only benefit the U.S.-ROC alliance, and in turn, that will strengthen our alliance even further. There's much we could talk about here, the various policies, the various hotspots, but just mentioning a few areas as we've talked about, efforts to advance a free and open and prosperous Indo-Pacific, including through the expansion of Korea's own policy, your new Indo-Pacific strategy and the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, but also working with ASEAN, the Pacific Island nations, efforts beyond the Indo-Pacific that will help to preserve the international rules-based order. whether that's Korea's participation in the NATO summit and its ongoing engagement with NATO, whether that's with G7 as we've discussed. The bottom line is that Korea's work to advance its vision of global pivotal state will advance alliance cooperation in the Indo-Pacific and far beyond, including places like Russia, Ukraine, and even in the Taiwan Straits to maintain the status quo there as well. Just to wrap up, if you look at the meaning of alliance very simply, it's identifying threats, challenges, and opportunities, either for one or both countries, and then partnering together to meet, overcome, or in the case of opportunities, to take advantage of them. And then these are a few ways that we can advance the alliance into the future, not just deepen our friendship and our bilateral relations, but strengthen the very fabric of our international community, fostering peace and stability on the peninsula and in the Indo-Pacific and throughout the world. I say this is the essence of a global comprehensive strategic alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back to some of your issues later on. And Professor Kim Hyun-wook, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to this important session with a theme of 70th anniversary of the ROK-US alliance. I think the alliance is especially becoming more and more important at this juncture because things are changing, international system is changing. There are a lot of global complex challenges coming out so that two countries have to cope with those challenges together. So I think it's the right time to think about what is the meaning of the alliance. I mean, the right time. Listening to what Ambassador Goldberg was speaking, I was kind of thinking about values again. I mean, because for the past 10 or 15 years or so, I mean, there were a lot of debates everywhere, and especially in South Korea too. Why do we need to stick to the values? I mean, what is more important? Is the interest more important? Money more important? Because China money was everywhere at the time. It's also during the Obama government, China was also spreading into every sphere of the United States. At that time, I still remember that maybe a lot of U.S. elites and policymakers kind of thinking that, oh, maybe the U.S. would not be able to cope with China anymore because we are pretty much, mixed with Chinese influence, Chinese money in the States. And that kind of atmosphere was here in South Korea too. After South Korea began to, normalize the relationship, open the relationship with China, and South Korea-China economic relationship began to get deepened, there was pretty much a lot of debates in South Korea. What is more important? Security more important or economy more important? Is value more important or interest more important? So there was a lot of repercussions from the South Korean people. Hey, why do we need to stick to values? It's something that doesn't pay. It's something that only exists as a word. But when I was thinking about values, I mean, that's something that we don't really know the importance of when you are living together with specific values. We are enjoying freedom. We don't know this. We don't think the value of freedom all the time. My doctorate thesis advisor always used to tell me that we are living with air, but without air we die. We don't always think the value and importance of air. I mean, the value is something like that. Values determine the mindset of thinking of everybody, people. And also it's institutionalized into political field and economic field. Maybe some specific and spontaneous monetary interests can come out of somewhere else, but the more fundamental economic system and economic interests we are mingled with our values. So I think that this is the right timing to think about what is the important values of the U.S.-Allocated alliance. I mean, the birth of the alliance, I think, came out of this kind of same background. After the Korean War was over, we were so desperate for our security. Syngman Rhee, president at the time, released the anti-militarist prisoners to cut off the process of armistice negotiation, and afterwards finally signed the treaty between the U.S. and ROK, Mutual Defense Treaty. And also afterwards, finally the United States President Truman realized the dangers of communist bloc and signed the NSC 68 documents, which tripled the defense budget of the United States and rearmed Germany afterwards. So I think the birth of the US-ROK alliance is very dramatic. It's not something that came out of, automatically. The US changed its global, alliance policies afterwards, and the US and South Korea was desperate. If there was no security mutual defense treaty between two countries, I think there might have been second or third Korean War in the Korean Peninsula. So let me turn to homework or some challenges or characteristics of the current stage of the US-ROK alliance. I think first one is that there is some changes of threat perceptions. Before US and ROK alliance, the only threat perception was North Korea threat, but it's getting more and more diverse. We changed the alliance into Comprehensive Strategic Alliance in the year 2009, but it was not, well implemented because the regional issue was pretty much, dominated by the China issues. So South Korea did not really want to deal with the China threat at the time. Now, the U.S. priority and foremost important threat for the United States is China. And I think, Yoon Suk-yeol government, I think one important policy achievement of Yoon Suk-yeol government is to set up a different, basis of, China-South Korea relations based upon reciprocal relations. I mean, we witnessed that at the THAAD deployment, China focused on the core interests of China because arguing that THAAD is, hampering and damaging Chinese security. But now at the Yoon Suk-yeol government, South Korea is also talking back. Hey, our interest is also important. Our security is also important. Now, North Korea is now nuclear. They are now a nuclear state, and they're testing a lot of weapons. And our security interest is foremost important thing. So I think that's a very big change of the Yoon Suk-yeol government's policies. Second thing is that danger of nuclear weapons is getting more and more widespread. I mean, there was a war in Ukraine, and Russian Prime Minister leader Putin began to talk about the possible use of nuclear weapons, which had a lot of influences. It impacted NATO. It impacted a lot of alliances in Asia. NATO gang together, they were thinking about what to do about possible use of Russia's nuclear weapons. In Asia, Japan was worrying, South Korea is worrying. Okay, now in South Korea, North Korea is now nuclear, and what do? The nuclear disparity is there, and we need more nuclear umbrella from the United States. And the bottom line was the creation of NCG, Nuclear Consultative Group, which I think was a very important first step. I don't want to say that is final outcome. I think that's a very important step for the nuclear umbrella for South Korea. So I think this kinds of nuclear weapons and nuclear umbrella-based alliance relationship between U.S. and South Korea, I think is something new, very important character for the alliance. Third one, I think, is economic security issues. U.S., I think, is trying to adjust a previous globalized pattern of trade systems. It is now decoupling China. It is de-risking China issues. And in the middle of that, I think there are a lot of things to adjust between US and ROK. As US is adjusting global supply chain, I think there should be some policy adjustment between US and ROK so that the alliance relationship will be win-win outcome. So I think that's a big homework we have to think and solve in the near future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And we have heard all four speakers, and before we go into next round of discussion, Ambassador Goldberg, would you like to make some comment in overall about four presentations?
Well, I think the presentations align very well with what was achieved in Washington with both the summit declaration, the joint statement, as well as the Washington Declaration, which I think, as was expressed here, did four different things, and some of them are controversial here for those who have been pressing for a greater say or in nuclear policy, or more to the point for nuclear sovereignty or a nuclear program of some sort here. One of them is the absolute ironclad commitment that was made, if you read the document, the Washington Declaration, on both our commitment to act decisively and overwhelmingly in the face of an attack from North Korea, followed by a statement that President Biden made at the press conference afterwards that it would represent the end of the regime. Coming from the President of the United States, that's a serious development. The second, of course, is the establishment of the Nuclear Consultative Group, which needs filling out, but which represents, of course, a new policy of more information sharing, more of an idea of how we will react both strategically but also in critical moments. The third is the recommitment of the Republic of Korea to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that is an important statement, and one that goes along with the American commitment to provide its nuclear umbrella, as we've done for many, many years. But it's an important statement taking into account what Professor Lee was talking about in terms of the political and economic consequences of a nuclear program. It's not just a military decision. The last is the statement in the Washington Declaration leaving open and in fact encouraging diplomacy as the solution with North Korea. They're not responding at the moment. They will at some point, but it's important to leave that option open and to re-emphasize it as the way forward for actually resolving the denuclearization of the peninsula, which is another dilemma here in South Korea, because we're not just talking about we're talking about the denuclearization of North Korea. They're the only ones with nuclear weapons on the peninsula. What we're talking about is keeping it, or moving towards denuclearization.
Well, thank you very much. I think Patrick has something to say about this too, the similar one, and CG and so on.
I simply wanted to add that rather than loss of sovereignty for South Korea, President Yoon negotiated a great deal for South Korea. The cost to South Korea of acquiring an independent nuclear weapon would be horrendous. Don't take my word for it. Just listen to yesterday's panel where we had a Chinese professor say that in 5 years South Korea may have a nuclear weapon, and this will be one of the biggest and most profound changes in Northeast Asia and in Asia, and he didn't mean it in a positive way. What President Yoon negotiated was a bigger voice in leveraging America's unequaled strategic nuclear platforms that we built over decades through a Cold War, and we couldn't build again if we had to start from scratch. So we're leveraging that tremendous asset for the security of South Korea and the United States. And the voice doesn't just end with the declaration. It allows for South Korea to think through the type of force posture, the strategic assets. And it will be, yes, the finger on the button remains in Washington, but the voice is in the ear of Washington every second, every day. And it's a close relationship. And the ambassador here is one conduit of that, but also the direct ROK military working with INDOPACOM and the Strategic Command. That is now a mechanism that's going to grow, and that's a tremendous way to preserve deterrence, which is the goal, not to fight, not to ruin the economy, not to break down the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and other institutions we built as part of the liberal rules-based order, but to strengthen them. So this is a win-win for South Korea and the United States.
Well, thank you very much for your strengthened comment on, in addition to Ambassador Goldberg's comment. Ukraine has been mentioned a couple of times among the speakers, and let me ask one of you, what kind of lessons can we draw from Ukraine situation in terms of strengthening Korea-U.S. alliance vis-a-vis North Korea? Alison, would you respond first?
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, when I was thinking about South Korea and the war between Russia and Ukraine, I tend to still adhere to the strength that strength deters, and that weakness is provocative. So basically, peace through strength concept. And I think that is reinforced through what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and how you would apply that to South Korea-U.S. alliance, and how you apply that to North Korea is that what Korea is doing to strengthen your own capabilities and to deepen and strengthen the alliance will go a long way to enhancing deterrence, so that you don't have that kind of situation here on the peninsula. So it's very simple, but I think that what you're doing to strengthen not only your military capabilities, but the alliance with the United States, the trilateral cooperation, that will result in greater deterrence and peace on the peninsula.
Hyunwook?
Yes, I mentioned briefly about the war in Ukraine. I think there are a lot of critical events and junctures happening. Of course, U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, war in Ukraine. I don't know what else would happen in the future. I mean, things are really abrupt and dynamic. I think war in Ukraine first realized, make South Korean people realize that, oh, thank God we have alliance. We have U.S.-South Korea alliance. I mean, if any country surrounding South Korea attacks South Korea, I think alliance mechanism itself would work in any way. I'm not sure in what way the U.S. would try to protect South Korea, but I think the U.S. will do something, and that's something that gives very much high degree of assurance to South Korean people. Second, notwithstanding, very ironically, allies in Asia, including Japan and South Korea, they began to doubt the credibility of U.S. extended territories. I mean, look at what's going on in Japan. I mean, Japanese are thinking and worrying about the Taiwan Strait contingency, and they think that if something happens in Taiwan, they will be, directly, influenced by the Taiwan Strait contingency. And Japanese elites are possibly worrying about the possible use of Chinese non-strategic nuclear weapons around the Taiwan island, if some contingency happens. And they're asking more nuclear umbrella from the United States. And South Korea too. We got NCG. That's a very good outcome out of the summit meeting. very important first step. And as Patrick mentioned, that that gives benefits to both countries. So I think that's another important features and influences that had impact on the allies in Asia, which is different from the NATO countries.
Well, thank you very much. We have some more time, but well, unfortunately, Ambassador Goldberg has another important engagement back in Seoul. So I don't want to disappoint him by breaking his schedule. So thank you very much for participating our session, and I will let you go with big applause. I have a couple of more questions on our discussion. Well, China. While we stress the importance of the Korea-U.S. alliance, there is another factor that we should take into consideration, the Chinese factor, which will definitely affect us negatively. So what should we consider when China factor comes in the way for the way forward of our bilateral alliance? Well, Soo-hoon, would you respond?
So, adding on top of what Professor Kim said, I'm adding a little bit on the Ukraine first, briefly. And when President Biden, when he made a speech, State of Union in 2022, I believe, or 2021, he, quote unquote, he said U.S. will be protecting every inch of the NATO territory. In other words, there will be no direct the engagement in the Ukraine. But that's far different than what U.S.-Korea alliance is. So comparing and the lessons learned from the Russia invasion of Ukraine will be that, okay, Ukraine, U.S. ROK alliance will be much different. So it will be two different separate cases. So Chair's question about China factor in ROK-US alliance, I think I can develop a little more from Professor Kim's comment on Japanese perspective on Taiwan. Yes, when Taiwan uses strategic nuclear or non-strategic nuclear, what Japan learned from Ukrainian crisis was that there could be a contingency in Taiwan Strait. So my Japanese colleagues were a bit surprised that Koreans are not really aware of the contingencies that might happen in Taiwan. But of course, if there is a contingency in the Taiwan Strait, whether that will be air, sea battle, or landing operation, of course, U.S., as according to President Biden, may engage in the contingency, but we all know that there's a A280, and also we have the 7th Fleet coming in from Hawaii and also Japan. And if, I think the question will be more clarified, it's not going to be the ROK military, but beforehand, there will be a question of the USFK, and in regard to the US ROK alliance. So what's the role of the USFJ, and what would be the role of the USFK? Having like 40,000 Marines and the navies in the USFJ, and having like, out of 28,500 forces on the peninsula, about like 20,000 as the land ground forces. So we'll have to really look into the structure of the military and both the USFK and USFJ when we talk about the China factor. Even we are considering the US ROK alliance at this point. So summarizing my takeaway from the question will be, yes, RK-US alliance will have to, when we talk about the China factor, we'll have to discuss the topic in different steps. So in the Pacific Command, USFK, USFJ will be considered first. And that's the question we'll have to address. And then the ROC Army or Navy or the Air Force later on. So that's as far as I can say for now.
Patrick, you have...
Certainly, Ambassador Kim, I think it's obvious that China, when it doesn't get its way as a big power, it tries to change the view of the actor who's not acting in compliance. We saw that with THAAD, but I think we'll see a whole range of expressions of displeasure from Beijing over South Korea's stronger alignment on policies that seem to intrude on China's interests. Even the statement, the strong repeated statement that the Taiwan Strait issue is a global issue, that peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is a global issue. Now, from a US perspective, that's a statement of fact. And more countries from Europe and Asia are affirming the fact that, yes, it is actually a fact that peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is a global issue. It affects everybody's economy, among other things. I think China is not objecting to that so much, but they worry about this potential support against the one China policy, against their core of core interests. And I think that's where China has to be dealt with carefully and intelligently, for the same reason that we talked about de-risking not being a clearly defined roadmap, but rather an objective in general, that we want to protect certain core emerging technology areas, but we also want trade and investment, and we want to have what President Yoon said, China to be a great regional partner. That's what it says in the Indo-Pacific strategy of South Korea. So we're trying to balance these seemingly contradictory ideas, and there's some tension, but they don't have to be in contradiction. It depends in part on how China responds. So to wrap up on this question of the China factor, on the specific flashpoint of Taiwan, we're trying to make sure all of our voices are heard now in a time of peace, that China doesn't misunderstand and miscalculate, that there will be tremendous repercussions if they resort to force to settle this issue rather than to try to resolve it peacefully. And at the same time, South Korea is not looking to make China an enemy. It's looking to stand up for South Korean interests. It's no longer going to be quiet about them. And there will be some pushback and pressure, but that's why South Korea is intelligently thinking about, let's align with more allies and partners ourselves. Let's join that economic framework against coercion with the G7 plus countries, because that will give us more support here in South Korea to push back from coercion and from pressure and threats.
Well, thank you very much. This China factor reminds me of my days in the foreign ministry in 2004 and 2005, when we heavily engaged with the U.S. administration surrounding the issue of strategic flexibility. I think from time to time, we need to think about the contingency situation with regard to that, the strategic flexibility as well. We have many more things to discuss, including sanctions and the value versus interest. This is a very fundamental question as well. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. I don't unfortunately have time to open the floor to take any questions from the audience. But I would say this has been a very enlightening discussion, and I thank all the participants, including Ambassador Goldberg, who just left, and thank you very much for participation. This concludes our session. Thank you.